We are continuing our Meals with Jesus series where last week Laura took us through the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000, a pretty spectacular meal in which 5,000 men plus women and children were fed from just 5 loaves and 2 fish. And it's a famous story, as Laura said, found in each of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and taken as a miraculous sign of God's provision and generosity. However, there's another story which is found in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark in which a very similar miraculous feeding takes place. A story known as the feeding of the 4,000. So let's take a look at this from Mark chapter 8.
During those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way, because some of them have come a long distance." His disciples answered, "But where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them?" "How many loaves do you have?" Jesus asked. 7, they replied. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people, and they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also, and told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. Afterwards, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 were present.
So, maybe not quite as familiar a story as the feeding of the 5,000, but it's a story, nevertheless, with many similarities to that other one, but also some pretty key differences to Jesus' feeding of the 5,000. So what might these similarities, these differences be? Well, for a start, this feeding of the 4,000 takes place in a different location than the feeding of the 5,000. So here's the region, the lake or the Sea of Galilee, as it's known in Israel. And the feeding of the 5,000 was reckoned to have taken place up there on the northwest side of the lake, the Sea of Galilee. Indeed, there's an ancient church site in this area which has a 5th century mosaic on the floor depicting a basket of loaves and 2 fish. And the fact that this early mosaic is there means there's a decent chance that they've identified the actual location where Jesus did the feeding of the 5,000. It's a very pretty mosaic, and if you're a gullible tourist like me, you can buy all sorts of crockery when you go to Israel and get your fish and loaves on a nice little plate there. What's more, though, that the mosaic is located in front of a rock which has been left sitting proud of the floor. And this rock is reckoned to be the same rock on which Jesus put the 5 loaves and fish when he prayed over them. Now, who knows? Who knows if that's true or not, but it's been traditionally identified as the place for some reason, and this takes pride of place in the church building. You can see the mosaic and the rock in the distance there underneath the communion table at the end, which is a nice touch when you think about it, coming to receive bread and wine with that mosaic on the floor under the table beside that rock. So that's the location of the feeding of the 5,000. But for Jesus' feeding of the 4,000, well, Mark's gospel tells us that Jesus was in the region known as the Decapolis, which is around there. That's where the feeding of the 4,000, they reckon, took place, on the other side of the lake. Now, why might this be significant? Well, while the feeding of the 5,000 took place in a very Jewish area, the feeding of the 4,000 took place in a very non-Jewish area, better known as a Gentile area, Gentiles being the name for non-Jewish people. Now, the fact that these two different but similar miracles took place, one in a Jewish area and one in a Gentile area, well, that reality is further underlined by the detail that Laura mentioned last week concerning the amount of bread that was left over and collected after each meal. So if you recall, after the feeding of the 5,000, we were told that there were 12 baskets of bread left over. 12 being a number that's heavily associated with the Jewish people, most famously because of the 12 tribes of Israel. But the keen-eared among us this morning would have noted that after the feeding of the 4,000, there were 7 baskets of leftovers. So why might 7 be significant? Well, back in the book of Deuteronomy, we're told there were 7 non-Jewish nations, we might say 7 tribes even, who the Israelites defeated in battle. Here's the names of them, and if you want any good scores in Scrabble, make a note of these because they're not easy to say. It's the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. 7 nations larger and stronger than you Israelites. And yet 7 nations who the armies of Israel defeated to take the land that they felt God had promised them. So just as 12 represents the Jewish people, so 7 represents these non-Jewish people, people who have traditionally been seen perhaps as the enemies of the Jewish people. But what's fascinating here is that in these 2 miraculous meals, Jesus makes a point of feeding both Jews and Gentiles, each on their own turf, in their own territory. He's equally compassionate, equally generous, equally providing for both. And it seems Jesus uses these 2 meals to say, look, I have come for all people, regardless of race or religion. I'm going to be gracious and compassionate to everyone, and I want you to do the same. Now, as you can appreciate, for Jesus' 12 Jewish disciples, and again, the number 12 is significant there. This would have perhaps been difficult for them to accept since they'd have been raised to believe in their special status as God's chosen people. And so what's fascinating is the way we're told Jesus goes on to underline the importance of these baskets and the general message of inclusion that he'd come to champion. You see, a few verses after this feeding of the 4,000, the disciples are with Jesus in a boat crossing back to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, to the region where they lived. But as seems to be their habit, the disciples weren't exactly the best at forward planning because once again, we're told they'd run out of food. So we're told this. We're told the disciples had forgotten to bring bread except for 1 loaf that they had with them in the boat. Now this is followed by the disciples discussing things, including the bread among themselves, at which point we're told this, that aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. And he said to them, do you still not understand? A bit of a riddle, maybe. But in other words, do you still not get, says Jesus, what I was trying to show you, that I, Jesus, have come to welcome and include and feed all people, both Jews and Gentiles, both the 12 and the 7. And what's more, there's a little detail at the beginning of that exchange that's easy to miss, but may well be significant. If we go back to it, it says this. It says, the disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf that they had with them in the boat. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? So, the gospel writer, Mark, he tells us that they had one loaf of bread with them in the boat, while Jesus remarks that the disciples seem to be saying that they have no bread. So which is it? Which is it? Well, maybe both could be true. Because while they may not have had any literal bread with them, as Jesus seems to imply, I wonder if the writer Mark is not suggesting that actually in Jesus they have with them the one bread, the bread of life, the one and only bread they'll need, the one bread on whom all people are invited to feed. And that, I would suggest, is perhaps the most important takeaway from this particular meal with Jesus when he feeds the 4,000. Because it's a reminder that Jesus is the bread of life for all. The host who invites all people to his meal and invites all people to feed on him in their lives. So in gratitude for, and maybe in response to the way in which Jesus invites and includes us, I guess my prayer is that our invitation to and our inclusion of people from every walk of life might be the story of our faith, both this week and beyond.